Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, also Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy. I'm delighted to have everyone here today for our event, Self-Censorship Among China Hands, Myth and Reality. I'm also the Chief Safety Officer for today's event. You may not know it, but there's a hurricane coming, or the remnants of a hurricane coming, so maybe it's more serious today. But if there is any problems, we've got exits back here. We're going to meet across the street. It's not going to happen, but just be aware, we're supposed to protect you. That's our job. So today's topic actually touches a raw nerve for me, because there are a lot of doubts in Washington, D.C., among some in government and the media about this country's China experts. China hands have long been suspect. In the 1950s, many were accused of being communists. And as the Cold War drew to a close, the accusation became that China experts liked China, what some would call clientitis. Over the past 2 decades, the charge has shifted to questions of China experts' courage and accuse them of intentionally pulling their punches in topics like in the research that they choose to look at, the conclusions they draw, and in apparently avoiding speaking up on sensitive policy issues, all in order not to offend official China. Now, some may be seen as unwitting props in the Communist Party's effort to portray China as an upstanding country that deserves respect and admiration. And others are having warped views because China is their client, literally. Well, at least for the American companies that do business in China. So I take these criticisms deeply personally and professionally, since these accusations challenge the basic integrity of China experts and as people. But at the same time, I also know that we shouldn't engage in knee-jerk defensiveness, because that type of defensiveness is just as bad as sloppy accusations. Now, this debate about China experts is partly infused by a broader conversation we're having in the United States about the professional norms of China hands and what our role in American society ought to be. I see at least 2 broad visions. The first is that of what I'd call the independent scholar, who's supposed to follow their curiosity wherever it leads, create new knowledge, but offer tentative, probabilistic answers to these questions. Their job is to speak truth to power wherever power resides, at home as well as abroad, but they stay out of the limelight. And American society's job is to protect their intellectual freedom. The second vision of the China expert is what I might call the patriotic expert. You do your research, but you also fulfill your obligation of calling out threats to freedom and to the United States. The patriotic expert is supposed to challenge China's authority because of its authoritarian system, which is illegitimate. There's an additional expectation that Western experts have an obligation to speak up, in part because China's own domestic experts cannot, because they are either blind to their problems or face severe repercussions when they do speak up. Now, these are, of course, 2 ideal types, and there's some overlap between the 2, but my sense is that part of the challenge of the debate is that we're speaking past each other because there's these 2 different visions. In any case, we're having 2 debates, a narrow one about scholarly behavior, another about the role of China experts in society, but both of these debates have largely gone around in circles because people have just tossed around anecdotes or fired back with moral outrage. Until now. Sheena Greitens and Rory Truex have done the first large-scale survey of China experts on their behavior. In a minute, I'm going to turn the floor over to them. And following their presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with a who's who panel with Sophie Richardson, Yun Sun, and Isaac Stone-Fish. And I'll give them a proper introduction when we turn to the panel. But let me first introduce Sheena and Rory. Now, I wish American Americans outside academia knew what great young China scholars our country has. They have amazing language skills, deep familiarity with Chinese culture and that of their neighbors. They have lots of experience on the ground in China. They're trained in sophisticated social science methods, and increasingly they are engaged in the public conversation about China and U.S. China relations on the national stage and in the communities where they live. And two of them are with us here today. Sheena Greitens is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri and an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair here at CSIS. She is also affiliated with a relatively well-known think tank up the street whose name begins with a B. She has her PhD from Harvard, an MPhil from Oxford, and BA from Stanford. Sheena's research covers East Asia, security studies, and the politics of democracy and dictatorship. And her first book has the very non-panda-hugging title, Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence. Rory Truex is an assistant professor of politics and public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He studies comparative politics, focusing on China and other non-democratic regimes. His dissertation and book project, Representation Within Borders, explains the nature of legislator behavior in China's National People's Congress. Rory has developed one of the most creative ways to figure out if those members of China's legislature who are business people benefit from being in the legislature. You would think that is an obvious question, but it's not, and Rory came up with an ingenious way to answer that question. His other current projects explore how Chinese citizens evaluate their political system, the relationship between media bias and credibility in non-democracies, and patterns in dissident behavior and punishment. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton, so he's gone home now, and he got his PhD from Yale. So I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to turn the floor over to Sheena and Rory. Please join me in welcoming them to CSIS.
Good morning. I'm so pleased to see all of you today, and I want to thank Scott and CSIS for hosting us today, and to all of the panelists for your thoughtful comments and reading of our work. I also want to give a huge amount of credit to Rory. This project was originally his idea, and it's been a really interesting and rewarding one to work on. So I'm really grateful to the group that's gathered here today for making this conversation possible. Some of the issues that we're talking about today emerged earlier, around this time last year for the first time, with the news that several prominent academic presses had censored or pulled articles from their databases and their publications that were available in China. And the conversation picked up again this spring with a series of discussions about the role of the scholarly community and whether or not academics were engaged in a wave of self-censorship and pulling their punches about how they talked publicly about China and how they wrote or worked on China. And so you see tweets like this one from a journalist and editor who focuses on China, talking about both careerism and cowardice as characteristics of academics who work on China and the Chinese political system. And then one of our panelists later this morning wrote a piece that referred to an epidemic of self-censorship among people who work on and talk about China. At this point in the discussion, Rory and I had been working on this survey project for a couple of months. And I will say that when we started talking about this in December or January of last year and early 2018, it emerged from a concern that we both had that there was potentially self-censorship within our own field. We had both done graduate training and been cautioned and heard stories that we've now come to think of as cautionary parables about doing risky work and the potential professional consequences that might have. And so we wanted to know simply, was that actually true? Would you actually put your career at risk by working on sensitive topics? We are both people who are interested in some of these sensitive questions. Or potentially sensitive questions, and we're interested in how the Chinese government actually thought about the work that we saw others doing and that we were interested in doing ourselves. And we had noticed that there were other people who worked on sensitive subjects. So a scholar here who works on Xinjiang, who's testified to Congress about what's happening in Xinjiang with re-education camps in 2017 and 2018, said actually, you know, I don't think you're very likely to get blacklisted. And so we realized that we just really didn't have any data on this. And so Rory and I set out to design a survey that might actually give us some answers to some of these questions about how frequent these behaviors were. So in the survey, and today, you know, what I wanted to talk about are the 3 core questions that came out of our research. One was just what actually happens when scholars try to work in and on China? What is the nature of what we termed repressive experiences? And I'll go through how we break that term up, what we mean by that in just a minute. But we also wanted to know then how academics, researchers at universities or think tanks responded to having these experiences, how it changed their behavior and the nature of the conclusions that they might be drawing. And we also wanted to know sort of both how that looked in terms of output, but also how people navigated these issues very practically in trying to do their work on the ground. So we fielded a survey that we sent to around 2,000 people over the summer. The response rate was relatively high for an online survey of academics over the summer. It was about 600 people. And we've gotten a couple of questions, so I'll just address this since I think it's likely to be asked during the question and answer. Wouldn't people be afraid of responding to, if they'd had a repressive experience, are they less likely to take the survey? And that's possible. We've had people suggest that to us, but we actually also had people tell us the reverse, that having a repressive experience or something, their research being interfered with in some way made them more likely to fill out the survey because they wanted somebody to know that this had been an issue. So the reality is we don't know whether it made people more or less likely. The arguments go both ways. Whether it made them more or less likely to answer the survey. What we do know is that the survey results, the people who took the survey were broadly representative of the people we sent the survey to. So of the China field, as the 2,000 people, it wasn't as if one group of people just decided not to answer the questions. So the survey is pretty broadly representative. And so this is the chart that you'll see me come back to a couple of times today, but it's sort of the core finding. And I will say that we see this project actually as having 2 stories in it. So we talked a lot at the beginning about self-censorship, which is a story about experts and about the China hands community of people who might be in this room. But we also see it as a story about China and how China interacts with the world. And in particular, a piece of Chinese foreign policy that occurs mostly inside China, but is about the boundary between China and the international community, in particular the scholarly community, how China looks at the potential for international actors who are in China to do things that might be in some way sensitive or maybe even threatening. And so we see this as a story in part about China's behavior in the world today. And so when we looked at the data, I'll go through most of this, we asked about 12 different categories of what we called potential repressive incidents. And it was everything from having difficulty getting a visa to being permanently denied a visa, being asked to go in and explain your research to the authorities in China, having a colleague contacted or warned about the sensitivity of your work, having trouble accessing an archive, or having interview subjects sort of suddenly withdraw without an explanation or tell you at the last minute that they couldn't talk about something. So we asked about 12 different categories. And you'll see here that the rates of these experiences actually varied quite a bit. And we found, for example, that somewhere between 2 and 5% of people were likely to either have difficulty getting a visa, and that it's much more common to have a temporary issue, a one-off issue with a visa, and then be able to get a visa in the future, than it is to be sort of permanently and definitely blacklisted. There were only a handful of people in the survey who had had that happen to them. On the other hand, it was much more common to have trouble accessing an archive. So about 25% of the people that we talked to had had trouble accessing specific materials in an archive. And somewhere between 12 and 16% of people had had a colleague warned about the sensitivity of their research. We also asked in the survey for people to describe these experiences in some level of detail. And so the paper has just been conditionally accepted by China Quarterly. When it comes out in its final form, we're planning to put up all of these comments so people can read through the data and see for themselves. But we were able to get stories like this, and we literally have a couple thousand of these. So for example, when you're somebody who was denied a visa, I received a formal invitation from one part of the Chinese government. I didn't get a formal indication on my passport that the application was denied, but I was just told verbally that it wasn't approved. People who are denied access to an archive sometimes are told formally, nope, you can't get in, and sometimes they're told, things are being digitized, the material's just not available, and then a junior colleague or the archive will say, actually it is available, just not to you today. And so we were able to get a fair amount of qualitative detail on these incidents by asking people to describe them. We talked to people about their experiences being so-called taken for tea. I will add, I've had this experience. I've been asked to go in and explain my research to the authorities in China. None of these are my experience, but we were again able to get a sense of the variety of types of actors and the settings in which this occurred. And I can go into more detail in the Q&A about this. But sometimes it's in an academic setting, sometimes it's a more formal member of the police or local security apparatus. The formality and the setting tend to really vary on these types of scenarios. We looked at experiences over time, and we found that actually not a lot of them had increased over time. We thought we might see an increase. There's been a lot of discussion about tightening research conditions under Xi Jinping, so post-2012. And the main area that we saw this was actually in archival access, which appears to have gotten noticeably tighter, but a lot of the other types of incidents we looked at do not appear to have increased in frequency since 2012. Again, we asked people about their experiences being, in a couple of cases, physically detained or questioned for longer periods. And we're able to get, again, a fair amount of detail on the setting. We've taken out all of the identifying information for places. In some cases, if somebody gave us the town, the month, and the year, that would probably enable them to be identified, and so we've anonymized those details in order to protect the identity of the people responding to the survey. Again, not a big increase post-2012, so you can see 2008 to 2017. The pattern that has increased the most, again, is archival access. And that middle category there with the dark blue bars shows that the restrictions on archival access are by far the most common form of quote-unquote repressive experience. It's also one of the things that probably has less impact psychologically or even professionally than, for example, being detained or questioned, right? We're not making any claim that these have equivalent impact on people's psychology or their professional trajectory. Just that the frequency does really vary. So before I turn it over to Rory, let me just say that we really struggled with how to characterize this, because some people thought that these things happened to everyone doing work in China, and some people thought they happened to nobody. And so we decided to term them rare but real. which is not an attempt to either trivialize these experiences that people have had or to in any way compare them to experiences that, for example, scholars based in or working in China might have, which we think are likely to be more serious. We did not survey people working in China for a couple of reasons that I can talk about later. But we found that this does happen. It happens often enough that we think it's a real issue. But that in some cases, it's not as common as people thought. I thought that the rate of visa blacklisting would be higher than 2 or 5%. And so the message I took from that is actually that that if people are interested in research, they should do it safely and ethically, but they shouldn't be worried about sort of career constraints in doing this work. There's a lot of room to do work that is important and maybe even on sensitive topics, and people shouldn't worry that somehow this is going to have life-changing career consequences. The other thing I wanted to note, since we've had a high-profile case of another non-democracy appearing to use very direct violence against a journalist with the case that happened in the consulate in Istanbul, is that there were relatively few cases of foreign scholars being targeted directly by physical violence. Right? People are not getting beat up. They are not getting imprisoned for the most part. And I think that's an important distinction as we look at the experiences of journalists and scholars around the world today. We found actually that topics were not a super strong predictor of what got people in trouble. There appears to be a much more local logic to a lot of this. And again, I'll come back to this in the question and answer. Your likelihood of being sort of targeted or getting involved in one of these incidents didn't really correlate with demographics, gender, ethnicity, what type of university you were at. Didn't correlate as much as we thought with topics. There are some topics where it appears to be a little more common to have issues if you are physically in a region like Tibet or Xinjiang doing field work, then your likelihood of having some kind of interaction that is constrained by the authorities is much higher, but not as much as we might have thought. And as I mentioned before, there's not as much of an increase under Xi Jinping as we might have expected. The last thing I want to highlight is the fourth point before I turn it over to Rory, and that is that we did not expect, when we started the survey, to find that it was more common for your colleagues or your friends, or if you have family in China, for your family to be contacted and warned or pressured about your research than it is for a scholar, him or herself, to be directly contacted. That phenomenon has been described in other research on protest demobilization and managing sensitivities in China as relational repression, the use of social ties to pressure or demobilize people who might be challenging the party state. And we found pretty clear evidence, both in the data, the quantitative data, and in the qualitative stories, that those ties are used to manage foreign scholars as well. And we think that that's a really important point when we get to talking about things like self-censorship, because there's a certain implication to the term self-censorship that suggests that it's all about you. And the Chinese party state's ability to leverage other people's safety and other people's well-being in order to maintain certain political boundaries is, I think, a question that we don't naturally associate with the term self-censorship, but it appears to us to be a really important part of how China manages the foreign scholarly and expert community. I'm going to let Rory take the discussion specifically on self-censorship from here, and really look forward to the discussion and all of your questions. So thank you. There you go.
Thank you. So as Sheena mentioned, the first half of our project was really about trying to understand repressive experiences and just document as many as we could. And then the second half of this survey was designed to measure how people thought about self-censorship and sensitivity, and how that might have affected the conduct of research about the Chinese system. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to let you all stare at this for a second. But one of the key themes of our project is that most people felt that their research was sensitive in some respects. So this top chart here, broken out across different fields, is the response to a question: how sensitive do you perceive your research to be? And what we find is that roughly 70% of respondents believe their research is either very sensitive or somewhat sensitive. That varies a little bit by field, with the highest values coming in political science and anthropology, and slightly lower in economics and history. So there's a general feeling among our respondents that they're doing work that is sensitive. Another interesting finding that we try to juxtapose with that is that actually relatively few people have ever received any indication that their research is sensitive. And so we asked people, have you ever received any contact or any indication directly from the Chinese government that your research is sensitive? And only about 25 or 30% of people had this sort of experience. Overall, most China scholars, 60%, have never had a repressive experience whatsoever. So any of the 13 experiences that we document, most people have actually never had anything happen, myself included. So I would actually be one of these people that perceives his research as sensitive, but has actually never had anything happen to me. And so we might, one conclusion one can draw from this is that maybe people are being a little bit too dramatic, but we actually think that that's probably the incorrect interpretation, in the sense that one of the key themes that came across in our open-ended responses, so we asked people how do they think about sensitivity and self-censorship. One of the key themes that came across, which is familiar to many of you who study China or know China, is this idea of ambiguity. So I think sometimes the image of censorship or repression looms larger than the reality as I reflect on my own work. At the same time, authoritarian states are adept at creating fuzzy boundaries precisely because they know that people will self-censor and stay far away from it. You never know where the border is, you only know where they have crossed it. So this is, in some sense, the way the Communist Party encourages people to comply, both for foreign researchers but also Chinese citizens. They create a boundary that is deliberately blurry as a way of encouraging people to stay far away from it. Another theme is that many of our respondents objected to the term self-censorship, and hopefully this will come out in the discussion today, is that the word self-censorship, first of all, it puts the onus on the person in the position of vulnerability, right? And so some people in our survey responded, we should stop calling this self-censorship, which suggests that the researcher is at fault, and just start calling what it is, which is censorship. And so that's something to keep in mind. Another aspect that people tried to bring out is that much of what we might call self-censorship is actually done in the name of protecting ourselves and our research subjects. So any project that's done in China, for those of you who are not familiar, has to go through what's known as an institutional review board process, where you have to identify any single possible risk to a research subject or an informant. And so that process alone encourages caution in the scholarly community. And many people said that they would welcomely, they would rather be accused of self-censorship than put someone in danger. Protecting people is the most important thing. And so that came across over and over again. If I have to ever choose in engaging in self-censorship and maintaining ethical research practices, I will choose to maintain ethical research practices. The anthropologists, by the way, have the best open-ended survey responses, just for those of you. They're very thoughtful about these issues, in part because I think they spend so much time in the field and working directly with research informants. The anthropologist creed, your first responsibility is the safety, security, and well-being of your research collaborators or informants. This is more important than your publication or your tenure or your degree. So this idea that accusations of self-censorship are in some sense going against what we're taught, which is to protect our subjects. Overall, our findings from this part, I just want to summarize them really quickly. I will say some of the descriptions of the China field in the media have been that China scholars are self-censoring and a kind of lack of self-awareness about this. Actually, we asked people, do you think self-censorship is a problem for the field? And 70% of people said they did. And one interpretation of this is that, oh, wow, everybody's self-censoring. We actually, my personal interpretation, I don't want to speak for Sheena, is that actually the real truth here is that people are very thoughtful about this, and people think about this issue all the time. And they're trying to push the boundaries of research and do honest, critical research while dealing with a very sophisticated, uncertain authoritarian regime. And so self-censorship is something that's front and center in the minds of most China scholars. Finally, I would say one point that we need to emphasize is that the constraints facing so-called foreign China scholars, folks like myself and Sheena, are much, much, much different than the constraints facing people of Chinese ethnicity, Chinese citizens, or people who have family ties in China. The way that the regime applies pressure to those folks is much more direct and much more severe. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And when I go to a political science conference, I'm often I don't see a lot of cowardice. I personally see a lot of courage, especially among my colleagues who are Chinese citizens. In terms of policy implications, and this is something that we are excited to be here for this moment and to have this sort of conversation, but these are some of our initial intuitions. The first thing I think we should be doing is just providing information to people, especially to young scholars, undergraduates, graduate students, about some of the risks that happen when one conducts research in China. And that's hopefully where our project comes in, is that we can provide that information to people and we have actual data. At least for when I was being trained, I just didn't know what the risks were and what the range of possibilities were. So I think that alone hopefully will help people deal with the research environment. I would also encourage us as a community to avoid playing kind of the blame game and imputing the integrity of the China field or individual China scholars for a number of reasons. The first is that one thing that came across in our survey data is that you never really know the constraints that someone is facing. So you never really know if they have family in China or if they've been threatened or had some pressure. And so people are doing the best they can. And I've always felt that this is, in some sense, blaming the victim. The issue here is not the scholar, it's the authoritarian regime which they study, which is hostile to academic freedom. And so it's important to, I think, shift the conversation towards what can be done to protect scholars as opposed to blaming them. Finally, I think it's important always to place the problem in appropriate perspective. This conversation really started happening over the summer, right when the Xinjiang crisis was coming to a fore. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm sure many of you are, there's new emerging evidence that hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs, which are ethnic Muslim in China's Xinjiang province, are being detained and put into re-education centers against their will. And so this is the scholarly community, the things that are happening to us. It's always important to remember that it is nothing in comparison to the repression committed against the Chinese population, and I hope we don't lose sight of that. Finally, I would, just a final couple policy points. I guess I can skip one or two because I'm getting angrily told I have no time. My hope is that this conversation leads to greater coordination among universities. And so something that's come out in Isaac's work and other people's work is that universities are potentially having trouble dealing with China and are constantly being pressured to conform to the expectations of the Chinese government. And so my hope is that we can see greater coordination among universities and perhaps a shared statement of principles, so that when there is an issue at a place like UCSD, which hosted the Dalai Lama and faced some flack for that, it's not just UCSD's problem. What can Wisconsin do to help? What can Missouri do to help? What can Princeton do to help? So some sort of shared statement of principles so that the next time these sorts of things happen, the university community can respond collectively. So I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Sheena for joining me in this project. And we look forward to your comments. Thanks.
Really fantastic. And a lot of work in a very short amount of time. The pace at which you all put together the survey, carried out the survey, did the analysis, presented the results is lightning fast. Really to be commended. And unusual. You all just must be in great shape. Yeah. Let me now turn to our panelists who are going to offer their comments on the research and the broader question. Isaac Stonefish is a journalist and a senior fellow at Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations in New York City. He's previously served as Foreign Policy Magazine's Asia editor, and he managed coverage of the region and wrote about the politics, economics, and international affairs of China, Japan, and North Korea. He's a fluent Mandarin speaker, formerly lived in Beijing as a correspondent for Newsweek. And he spent 7 years living in China prior to joining foreign policy. Isaac is one of the country's leading public intellectuals on China, and we're delighted you're with us here today. Yun Sun is co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. She previously was a visiting fellow at Brookings, and before that, a China analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Beijing. Her bachelor's and master's are both from the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing, and she has another master's in international policy and practice from my alma mater, GW. Welcome to CSIS. And Sophie Richardson is the China director at Human Rights Watch. A graduate of the University of Virginia, Hopkins Nanjing Center, and Oberlin College, Dr. Richardson is the author of a major book and numerous articles on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, and human rights in Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Vietnam. She has testified before governments in Europe and before the U.S. Congress and written commentaries in every major popular publication in the United States. She's a tireless advocate for the rights of people across Asia, including in China, and I can't thank Sophie enough for being with us here today, really. So I'm going to give each of you, we said 6 to 8 minutes. That's a lot. That's not a whole lot of time to put together, to address all of the topics that were put on the table first by Sheena and Rory, but I know that you all will do your best, and then we'll get the conversation started with the audience as well. So I'm going to turn first to Isaac.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Rory and Sheena, for that great presentation and your really important work on the subject. So it's really difficult to figure out what's the best way to handle and deal with this issue, and I think one way to start thinking about it is the American universities that have branches in China. So Duke Qinshan, Hopkins Nanjing, NYU Shanghai. So let's say that a white American professor, because that distinction matters, a white American professor wants to do a talk at NYU Shanghai about the situation in Xinjiang, where, as Rory pointed out, there's roughly 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. And he has a few speakers from America who are willing to come. They get visas to come, but someone tells him that if he does this, it might get some of the local faculty in trouble. And so he decides not to do that. Is that self-censorship? Is that protecting your local faculty? Is that protecting your career? I would argue it's all three of those things. I would also argue it's probably the right thing to do. So these are very, very difficult issues that we're dealing with, and there's no hard and fast way. And I'm not an academic. It's easy for me to say, oh yes, if I were in NYU Shanghai, I would have that talk, but I might not. And there's certainly been cases when I was a journalist in Beijing that I didn't do stories because I was afraid they would get people in trouble. I was afraid that they might get me in trouble. It's certainly something that I feel like I am not innocent of. So I don't want to seem like I'm standing here and saying, oh yeah, my past is blameless, because I've certainly also, I would say, been complicit. I think what's really important as a person who writes about China and for the China field in general is that we need to figure out a way to communicate to our audience when the results are compromised, when this is bad information. So if you're a Chinese American scholar or a Chinese scholar living in the States, you certainly have it a lot more difficult when it comes to family ties and the way that the PRC and the party treats you and your research. And Rory, I think you're right. This is not the fault of the scholar. This is the fault of the Communist Party and the system in Beijing. But if you're writing a report and you're leaving out crucial information because you're trying to protect someone, even if that is the ethical thing to do, we have to figure out a way to communicate to the audience that this is an incomplete picture of the situation in China. Because if we're doing reports on what's going on in Tibet, what's going on in Xinjiang, and the way that the party relates to the military or other sensitive topics, and there are a lot of them, people reading these need to understand that they're not getting the complete picture. So whether or not that's self-censorship or whatever it is, I think our duty, besides to our own integrity and to the people that we work with, our duty is to the public to give them as complete and comprehensive a picture of what's happening in China as we can. Another part of censorship that rarely gets discussed is positive censorship. So Beijing practices two different kinds of censorship. One is suppressing information that's critical to the party, but the other is amplifying voices that are positive towards the party. So I forget who, but there's a few researchers last year who did this really great study about Chinese trolls, and they analyzed, I think, hundreds of millions of posts, and they found a really surprising thing, which was that a lot of the trolls weren't arguing with people who were critical of the party. They weren't even engaging. They were just saying nice things. They were just saying positive information about the party. And this is another way that censorship works, is that when we look for information about China and let's say we're not really familiar, and so we read a China Daily article or a People's Daily article. A lot of these articles don't actually engage with the way that a lot of Americans see China. They just present a completely different narrative. And if you pump out enough of this fluff, some of it starts to stick. So I'll give an example. The phrase, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, is a phrase that the party loves to use to explain one of the positive things that they've done over the last several decades. And it's true. The party has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, or the party is in part responsible for that. But we don't need to parrot that phrase. We can describe China the way that we feel is accurate based on our own experiences and our own research. And we don't need to use these expressions just because they're party-sanctioned expressions. And the reason we use them, we don't really think about it. I mean, it's basically, oh yeah, this is something that, for those who have spent time in China, so many people will tell you, and it sounds reasonable. And again, like I said, in fact, it is true, but we need to not feel like we are constrained by the way the party wants us to see things, but to act and think about it more independently. Another point I'd like to make about the debate between self-censorship and censorship is that just because you have a very aggressive or very quote-unquote anti-party conclusion doesn't mean you're not self-censoring. That's not the way it works. So many people I have spoken to about this story have said, oh yeah, I don't self-censor. I talk about Taiwan. I mentioned Tiananmen Square. Well, that's not how it works. It depends. Are you changing your conclusions and you're not saying something because you're afraid of offending someone, you're afraid of losing access? And it's very, very difficult to police, and we don't want to be thought police here. We don't want to say, oh, well, you said Tiananmen Massacre, but you didn't mention how many people died, or you didn't talk about the Great Leap Forward when you mentioned Tiananmen, because there's a lot of good reasons not to mention those things in reasonable conversation. By the same token, you can be an ardent supporter of the Communist Party and feel really good about what the party is doing in China. I don't agree with that, but one can have that view and not be self-censoring at all. That could be their actual view based on their own experiences. So it's a very, very difficult thing to gauge and to police, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I do want to make one point about the article that I did. So in the article, I felt like I was unfairly critical to Jim Millward, who is a Georgetown University professor, and he's done a lot of really excellent work on bringing to light the situation in Xinjiang and some of the awful things that are happening there. I don't think he's in the audience today, but people make mistakes, and I feel like I made a mistake in not giving him enough credit for the wonderful work that he's done. When people talk about journalists in China, a lot of time they use the metaphor of a ring of fire. That, especially as a white American, and it's slightly better for white male Americans than for females, when you're in China, when you're studying China, we have a lot of ability to protect ourselves and burn the ones that we come in contact with. And I think it's really important for when we're having conversations like this to both be very aware that we have the ability to burn some of the Chinese people that we come in contact with, but also to feel the ability to act and speak honestly without having sort of the party's voice in the back of our head. And one final point that I'll leave you with, I think so many conversations we have about China focus on sensitive issues and defining them as Xinjiang, Tibet, Tiananmen, Taiwan. I would argue that the most sensitive issue in China right now are not those issues, but does the party deserve to rule China? Are the men at the top of the party, and they're all men, are they the ones who should be the rulers of China? Should Xi Jinping rule China? And I would love to see a lot more scholarship and a lot more debate that focus on elite party issues. It's a very, very difficult thing to research, but when we talk about important scholarly information, I really think that's a crucial part of it. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Isaac. Yun?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the invitation. To be here. I really enjoyed reading the paper by the two authors. I was deeply impressed by the depth of the knowledge that they were able to obtain through this very thorough survey. And when I was preparing for my remark today and preparing how to respond to the paper, suddenly a question occurred to me: what if we have censorship when we discuss self-censorship? And that's a very, very disturbing cognitive question, because we don't know what we don't know, and we are not aware of the boundary of our thinking process, and where do we draw the line? So that's just a question that occurred to me, and I thought it would be interesting to point it out from the very beginning. So my comments is primarily focused on the China studies field and the ability to do research in China. And I always remember one of the first discussions that I had with my PhD advisor, Mike Lemchen, and the discussion was focused on a chapter from a book that Ken Liebersol and Mike did together, and it's about the difficulty and the inaccessibility of information as a China scholar. And this book was written back in 1980s. So especially the missing information, you just have logistical and realistic difficulty piecing the information together because you don't have that access to the information, and it's not available to you. So those are the first warning that, as an academic, that I received from my advisors. And so from day one, I think every China scholar, when they were entering the field, there is this mental preparedness that it's not an easy field. And we know how difficult it is to obtain information in China. However, we still choose it to be our focus, to be the area that we want to focus on. I think on one hand, there's personal interest, but on the other hand, the excitement, the uniqueness, the creativeness required to do good research and to get good information in a very difficult environment. I think those are partially the reasons that people choose a field, or the China experts choose this field. And when we discuss self-censorship, I think it's also very difficult to just dissect what is going on today. So there's a question as for what is the reference point? What do we compare China to? Do we compare China today to where it was 30 years ago? Or do we compare China today to the academic freedom that we enjoy here in the United States? Or do we compare China to Russia or to Arab countries where getting information also faces significant difficulty? So because of the different historical background and because of the different political system, I think it's very difficult to draw a conclusion to say that, well, because there are these difficulties doing research in China, therefore we have certain conclusions about the nature of the regime or the nature of the country. So because I grew up in China, I went to college in China, I got my first graduate degree in China. So in my memory, 20 years ago in China, getting information was even more difficult than it is today. And for the opinions different from the official opinions, those opinions are even more difficult to express in that environment. So one example that I remember particularly clearly is a question as about who started the Korean War. So 20 years ago, of course, today not only today, everyone here knows who started the Korean War back in 1950. But for a very long time in China, the statement or the expression that you would be able to find anywhere is that on June 25th of 1950, the Korean War broke out. So, I remember having this conversation, pushing my professors at the Foreign Affairs College, which is a diplomatic academy in China. I was pushing my professors at, who started it? They're like, well, it broke out. What do you mean it broke out? So, well, there are different stories, different interpretations as for exactly what happened on that day, but you should just remember that it broke out on that day. So I think that's an example of the kind of censorship or the self-censorship in China that was there 20 years ago. Yes, this was 1998. And then 10 years ago, I was based in Beijing as a China analyst for International Crisis Group. And we were focused primarily on the foreign policy issues, not really domestic political issues. And then this conversation, this discussion about China's foreign policy behaviors became much more flexible, and the information was much easier to access, at least as for 10 years ago in 2018 in Beijing. And there were debates that even today, I'm sure Isaac and Sophie, you all know that even today there are debates about what is really the best policy for China to pursue. But I have to acknowledge that there is a significant difference of subjects, among subjects. So working on foreign policy issues is slightly easier than working on domestic political issues, like the domestic political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. But 10 years ago, to have the debate, we'll have an honest conversation in China about who started the Korean War and whether it was a good decision for China to intervene, or even China's policy towards North Korea at that point was possible. So even today, so we know that on international politics or domestic politics within China, there are different voices, there are different information, different views. So from this angle, I feel that the discussion about the censorship and self-censorship on China studies, whether it is easier or more difficult, it really depends on the perspective and the angle that you tackle the issue. So at least from the a think tank person's perspective and on the issue of foreign policy, I think it has to be acknowledged that today the consensus among the Chinese academia and a lot of people here who work on China studies is that the research environment has become tighter than before. So if you look at the Chinese Communist Party's policy, so a few years ago they announced that 不许妄议中央大人方针, no making public and inappropriate comments about the central committee's policy and guidelines. And then today the key word is 定于一尊, which is the confirmed one authoritative voice. So compare today's situation to where it was 10 years ago under Hu or 20 years ago under Jiang, I think the environment or the censorship from the Chinese official sources have become worse. And for Chinese scholars in particular to express their different views, it has become more difficult. So that realistically has an implication for foreign scholars who work on China. But I have to say, on this issue, I have benefited tremendously from my mentors, including Alan Romberg, who was the director of East Asia program at Stimson Center, from Ken Liebersol, and from Professor Lam Chen at SAIS. So I feel that these mentors or these pioneers, these veterans, have really pointed out some of the possibilities that exist within the China studies field. So through their own meticulous approach to research, their utmost attention to details, and their unswerving pursuit of the truth, I think these mentors at least showed me and showed many young China scholars that the most important lesson to being a good policy analyst is that good research is conditioned upon the ability to see what others don't, and to understand rather than to judge, and to speak from the facts rather than from preferences. So especially in the China policy field, where scholars' views are subject to censorship and self-censorship, the lesson I learned from all these veterans and these pioneers is that nothing really speaks louder than solid research. So Alan Romberg used to say, focus on the issue, don't focus on the politics. And I think it is true, when you focus yourself on the deliberations or details of the issue, the politics become less an intervening variable. We are humbly and merely observers of politics among and within nations. So there's truth about the issues, there's no truth about the politics. So I feel that everyone emphasizes objectivity, but I always feel that objectivity is a subjective matter, it's a subjective term. We're all prisoners of our own background, our ideological preferences, our value system. So I feel that nobody can really be completely and absolutely objective. But for me, from my perspective as a person, as a China analyst in the think tank world, I think if you can try to understand the positions from outside and try to focus on the facts and focus on the analysis, there is a space to exist. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yun. Sophie?
Thanks. There's so much here to talk about. I almost don't know where to begin. Scott, thanks for the kind introduction. I do want to start by thanking Sheena and Rory for giving us some hard data and some analysis to work with on a question that doesn't just matter for academics or for policymakers or for advocacy organizations like mine. I think it matters to our efforts to pursue knowledge. And I don't think anybody goes into China studies without a pretty thick skin and a real commitment to knowing what good quality academic research looks like and being ready to really sort of go that distance. And I found the paper actually very encouraging in a way, because I think the bottom line really is get out there and try. Don't give up preemptively. Don't pre-select a topic. Don't turn away or not pursue a funding proposal. And I do find as I read papers like this, I reflect on my own academic experience. I did dissertation research in Beijing and in Nanning in the early aughts, looking at Chinese foreign policy towards Cambodia. And I'm astonished when I think back on that experience. Obviously, this was long before I worked for Human Rights Watch, and I was just a mere grad student. The still active, the still working diplomats who invited me to their homes and shared their stories with me. The documents that I could find in the libraries, as much by accident than anything else. Arguably my biggest constraints that year were trying not to freeze to death in the Beida Library and arguing with the women who did the photocopying about how much I wanted to Xerox every day. But nobody ever said no to me. Nobody said, I'm not going to talk about that. Nobody ever said, I'm not going to fund that. Thanks, Fulbright. And I think this research really reinforces that message to get out there and try. That said, I don't want to belittle the challenges that I think you're offering up here, and I assume that I'm here today with you partly because Scott knows Human Rights Watch has been working for a couple of years on a project about threats to academic freedom as a result of Chinese government pressure outside of China, so meaning what's happening on campuses in the US, Europe, Australia. For us, academic freedom is a key subset of the freedom of expression. That's sort of the human rights link there. And certainly one of the concerns we identify is about self-censorship. It's about threats on campuses. I think one of the biggest concerns we have, or the most profound concerns we have at the moment, is how students and scholars from the mainland are able to fully enjoy academic freedom on campuses, partly because some are monitored, or they're concerned they're being monitored. There's a long conversation about that component of this problem too. And we're having this discussion at a time when you hear odious rhetoric coming out of places like the White House suggesting that all Chinese students should be banned from the U.S. That is hardly the solution. I think that's a pretty appalling proposal. I think one of the complicating factors is what universities themselves are prepared to do for students and for scholars in protecting their ability either to try to get to China to do research, to do good research from outside, all of the different variables. I would commend people to the wonderful paper that's been written by Anna Lloyd, I hope I get this right, Damjanovic, at the Wilson Center that addresses a lot of these concerns. She has some very helpful recommendations that to some extent dovetail with yours. We're hoping to provide a draft code of conduct for universities to give some suggestions about how to respond to some of these kinds of pressures and really protect that space. A couple of questions and just a reflection on the paper itself. I really am curious to know if you think there have already been or will be longer-term consequences for particular fields. You have some disaggregated data about not just who thought their research was sensitive by field, but are we seeing so much tightening around, for example, discussions of elite politics that political science PhDs that look at that are diminishing while ones in other fields that are maybe considered to be less problematic are allowed to flourish? We just don't know, but I think as human beings, we want to have a sense of where the fields are going as a whole. as an advocacy organization, I feel duty bound to say, what should we all do about this, right? What's the answer, and where in particular do you two think the support should come from? Is it from your departments, from your universities, from something like the AAUP, from the U.S. government? Where do you see a helpful entity weighing in, especially in treatment that really is fundamentally arbitrary? I mean, I really appreciate that particular point, because I think what you're grappling with here is that the responses aren't consistent, and that's by design. It's partly by default, but it's also by design, right? If we all knew exactly what you had to avoid, we wouldn't be having this conversation, or we'd be having a very different one, and we would know how to respond to those constraints. And then just last but not least, or maybe this sounds completely appalling to you, here's the book I'm dying for you to write. This was the sentence that really jumped out at me. You wrote, respondents noted that political pressure from China, while relevant, was not as influential in their work as other disciplinary factors such as tenure and promotion requirements. But I think we live in a day and age where those are not so easily disaggregated anymore, right? When funding streams go with particular trends in research that maybe aren't just being driven by human inquiry or what journals want to publish. And so my plea to you would both to help us with the practical aspects of how we respond to this, but also to drill into that question too, so that we understand whether there's really, I'm not sure what the right word here is, but whether there's negative influence between those different variables too. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. All three commentators, super remarks, very helpful, diverse set of issues, comments, questions, suggestions. I do want to give the audience a chance to weigh in, but I want to first give Sheena and Rory a chance to respond to some of the things that have been said, and not everything that's been said, but maybe a couple points that you'd like to be able to respond to now before we get more.
Sure, thanks. First, great comments, and I think these are complex issues, and so it's nice to be able to discuss them with folks who've put a lot of time into thinking through them. I first want to say there are some individual cases that have come up in, for example, the press or the academic world where there's been behavior that's a problem. Either a journal special issue where people have pulled the articles because they're afraid of the political consequences, or cases where people have engaged in behavior that I would find problematic. And I don't want to downplay that, right? The point here is simply to say that this is a field that's made up of a lot of individual people, and individual behavior varies a lot. And so there is some behavior that might be problematic, but what we were trying to do is actually try to get a sense of the distribution of people's behavior, and to draw some attention to places where the boundaries are being pushed a little bit or can be productively pushed. And I wanted to highlight something that came up briefly at the end that Rory mentioned, but that I think in the question gets to Sophie's question about what we do about this. And I'm based at a university, although I have an affiliation here in Washington, D.C., but I really see a lot of this as a matter of institutional responsibility for academic institutions rather than individual scholars. We asked people how much assistance they had ever gotten in dealing with these issues from their universities or from places like academic presses if something like censorship had come up, and the answer was none, and in some cases was the most common response. And in a couple of cases, people said, and I didn't even try because when something comes up, the university comes and asks me to resolve a problem for them rather than having my back if an issue of academic freedom comes up working with China. And so I think that institutionally, universities are not well organized or well prepared to confront these issues, let alone to collaborate productively with each other on them. And so that's where I see the greatest space for some positive action, is actually in the role of these, Jim Millward has called this third-party censorship. So university presses acquiescing for market reasons about what's available in China, universities acquiescing to things because they are worried about the sustainability of foreign campuses that are based in China, but also in other parts of the world that might not be fully democratic. So I think that that's where the area where I really see the greatest potential positive steps forward. It's not necessarily a government solution. There's a role maybe for those actors, but a lot of it has to do with these third-party institutions and their responsibilities for academic freedom, because they shape a lot of what scholars are able to do. It is program directors in a lot of cases, rather than individual academics, who determine what events are held, where funding goes for individual scholars' research grants, internal funding, how student associations sort of do campus events or affect campus life. Right? A lot of this is made by administration, not by faculty. And so again, that's why I think the emphasis probably should be placed on those institutional actors. We've thought about doing a follow-up survey of those folks, but have been busy working on getting this project out and just haven't gotten to the next step yet. I think the last thing I'll say is that Isaac's example of positive censorship, which when I teach I call digital activism or sort of modern propaganda, is actually something that we know a lot about because we've had some scholars do some very sophisticated work. So I believe Isaac is probably referring to a paper by Gary King, Molly Roberts, and Jen Pan, who I went to graduate school with. And there's been work by Rongbin Han in Georgia and Georgia, right? Rongbin, is it Georgia? And Maria Repnikova on how China attempts to project its image and market its narratives. This is sophisticated work, and we know what we know about how China projects these positive this sort of positive censorship or digital activism because of the work of academics who've pushed boundaries. And so I actually see that as a case where academia has done a good job. But it also raises this question. I know that because I read academic books. I read Molly Roberts' book, which came out earlier this year, but came out with Princeton University Press, and I think, has compared to, you're not going to find it in an airport bookstore. The King, Pan, and Roberts papers, there's a whole series of papers on how China handles censorship, but most of these are in journals that are behind a paywall, and there's been some press coverage, but not a lot. And so I think there's a question of whether when we talk about self-censorship, we're talking about academic products. Jim Millward is fond of pointing out that there have been a dozen books on Xinjiang published in the last 3 or 4 years. That doesn't look like academic self-censorship to me. The question is how much of this gets into our public understanding of China, but there's a very complex set of questions that determine when academics do and don't translate their work into the public sphere, that have to do with disciplinary constraints, the fact that the way my university defines my job, public commentary is something I do voluntarily because I believe in its importance, but not because the university considers it part of my work. And it's not something that scholars are trained to do, let alone to do well. And so I think that expectation is a little bit at odds with the incentives that are fundamentally about how academic institutions work. And that's not a China-specific conversation. It has effects, but it's a much sort of more systemic issue about how academia is organized for public life and public information. And so I think it's hard to talk about China and the China field in isolation unless you have some sense of how academia as an institution works and what makes it possible to actually stay in the roles that Rory and I are in. I'll stop there.
So I'll just add something. I want to take a moment just actually to stand up for the China field a little bit, because I'm a little worried that the narrative is becoming, again, that there's this epidemic of self-censorship. So for me, the question is that we should be asking as a field, and for those watching the field, is are we as a group producing a body of scholarship that is excessively positive or rosy about the Chinese Communist Party? And I say this as someone who reads a lot of political science, for better or for worse, mostly worse. But I can answer that question definitively no, and I feel very, very confident in that. And the reason why is, so on the one hand, we're dealing with a sophisticated authoritarian regime that we're trying to avoid getting in trouble, but on the other hand, there are disciplinary pressures to write research that is critical, right? And so the hottest topics today about the Chinese political system are things like repression, human rights, propaganda, elite politics. There's actually a very, very vibrant research agenda on elite politics led by Victor Scher, Susan Shirk, Xiao Ma, and many other graduate students. And so I think as a field, if anything, there's a pressure in the opposite direction where we're incentivized to do research that's critical on China. And the proof is in the pudding, so we know that the Chinese government doesn't really like our work. There's been 320 articles just in the China Quarterly alone that the Chinese government felt the need to censor and block access for the Chinese people. So of course there always could be more research on critical issues, but I actually think as a field we're doing a lot of critical work, and we could easily be writing op-eds about the courage of the China field, but of course that would be self-aggrandizing. So let's avoid that. But I think it's just important to set that in context. And the last thing I would say, Sophie, to your question about where is the locus of assistance, I'm really excited to see what folks in the nonprofit community can do to help universities coordinated. My sense is, again, we blame university administrators for difficulties dealing with the Chinese government with respect to talks and hosting various speakers. But most of these people don't have a whole lot of China experience, and they're balancing a lot on their plates, and these are sort of one-off incidents that they frankly don't know what to do. And so I think some sort of coordination and shared statement of principles, that is welcome, and I think leadership from the nonprofit community on that front. I know you got a lot on your plate, but I think that would be definitely welcome for the field. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Super. Thank you. I have it's spurred a lot of thinking and comments and questions I'd like to ask and say, and I won't. I'm going to hold off because we've got a very patient and smart and thoughtful group here with us today. What I'd like to do, because we're running a little bit short on time, is take a group of comments or questions together. And so we have an audience watching online, and so we have microphones available that will come to you. So I'll call on you if you would just identify yourself and your institution, and keep your comment, your question as brief as possible. Then we'll be able to collect several and then let the panelists respond. So we'll start here with Don. Yeah, Don.
Thanks very much. I'm Don Clark. I'm at George Washington University. Hi, Rory. At the law school. So this is a really important issue, and I think I just want to thank Roy for his last point, which is that one good way of getting at it is to look at the positive side, what actually is being done, rather than looking at the negative and saying what is the evidence of self-censorship. But I do think that because it's so difficult to get a handle on, there's kind of a temptation to shift to questions that are more tractable. And I see two questions being discussed here that I think are evidence of that shift to the more tractable question that's not really going to get at the question of whether self-censorship is a problem. And the first one is the issue of, what's the ethical thing to do and who's to blame? That's an interesting question, but it's not the question of whether self-censorship is a widespread problem or not. The second issue that I think is something of a distraction is the issue unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, you spent a lot of time on in your paper, which is the incidence of repressive, how much repressive incidents do we get? And to me, that's a bit like looking at the incidence of a disease and not asking, what's the immunization rate? So we could look at smallpox. There's not a lot of smallpox, and that's because smallpox is not a problem. But we could also say there's not a lot of flu around, but the reason there's not a lot of flu around is because everybody gets immunized. And so we cannot exclude as a possible explanation of the low level of repression the possibility that everybody is self-censoring. I might even be encouraged to see a lot of incidents of repression, because that would certainly be evidence that nobody is self-censoring and they are pissing off the Chinese government. So I'm just not sure you can exclude sort of rampant self-censorship as a possible explanation of the low incidence of repressive incidents, and and conclude, as you do, that the low incidence means that there's a low risk. So I'd like you to address that. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to go in the far back. Our hands up, and then we'll come over here to Margaret.
Hi, Susie Jakes. I'm the editor of China File at the Asia Society, and I want to thank all of you for a really stimulating panel and discussion. I hope this is ongoing. My question actually relates a little bit to Don's, which is that I wonder if the picture would look a little bit different if, rather than looking at constraints in the form of repressive repercussions, you surveyed people about inducements. So instead of looking at the stick side, what happens to, what are the considerations for a scholar who has, for instance, high-level access to meetings at the party school, or a scholar of the military who is able to meet regularly with military officials, or a center that is suddenly receiving funding from China. Like where do the carrots fit into the picture of how scholars or how administrators or managers of scholars think about these questions?
Thank you. Margaret Pearson from University of Maryland. Rory and Sheena, you started out with a comment that part of the motivation for the paper was this information that scholars received about the China Quarterly and Cambridge University Press not publishing works on their China website. But I wonder if one of the reasons this whole conversation is really gaining traction right now has a lot to do with U.S. politics. And it reminded me of a paper that I had to read in college in the 1970s, so maybe some other old-timers will remember this. But it was a paper that talked about how U.S. scholarship on China very much reflected the U.S. political atmosphere of the time, so that in the 1950s, most scholars were anti-communist, right? And in the 1960s, reflecting U.S. politics. In the 1960s, maybe Mike, you remember this paper. In the 1960s, the idea was that all scholars were lefties, and so we were all writing wonderful things about the party. And then we shift to the 1970s, and we get the, particularly the late 1970s, in the reform program, and we get all scholars, being kind of capitalists in disguise. And so one of the concerns that I have, I'm sorry, this is not a question, this is really a comment. One of the concerns that I have is that in this echo chamber of Washington, D.C. in particular, that this idea of scholars as not standing up for what's right and for what's in America's interest really is a reflection of that kind of pressure that's always been there on U.S. scholars, as much as it is about the repression that really comes from China. So.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Blaine Johnson. I'm at the Center for American Progress. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on if the body of work that we're producing is in fact representative and critical. Do we think that that body of work is having the impact that it should have, that we're effective at communicating that body of work or changing opinions in, for example, the United States government and population? The reason I ask that is because you point to a couple of opportunities for influence that Beijing is leveraging, such as access to journals and journal articles being removed from archives. And so I'm curious as to, is our system of transmitting that body of work to policymakers or to the population also a target for Beijing? Thanks.
All right, I think that's 4 is probably enough on the table. Thank you, folks. Who wants to go first?
So thanks for those excellent comments. On Don's great point, I think you're right. I think self-censorship can be very ethical, but talking about the ethics isn't the same as talking about the self-censorship. So I think those things are true at the same time. I will push back against Rory's point about 12 books on Xinjiang. The question is not how many books are there on Xinjiang. The question, up to now I think impossible to answer, is how many books would there be on Xinjiang if people were writing as they chose to without fear of pressure or worry about getting people in trouble. And I think the work we do is critical is not the point. The point is, what would the work be without these pressures? And just one point on talking to the media. I'm very appreciative of both of you for being out here and doing a public event, because I really do feel like the scholars who know what they're talking about do need to talk to the media, because otherwise journalists will look and see who they can quote and see, oh gosh, here's this guy, Peter Navarro, I can talk to him because he's accessible. So get your voices out there, because otherwise it'll be filled with other voices that shouldn't be amplified.
A couple points. Don, I think that's an excellent criticism and something that we need to think about more. One thing that was interesting to me that emerged from the findings is that actually whether or not you are repressed is really only weakly related to the research you're actually doing. So there are plenty of people doing research on Xinjiang and Tibet that actually haven't had visa issues or haven't had those sorts of problems. When you're in the field and you get taken for tea, it's not as if the Chinese government is sitting there thinking, oh, I'm going to go get it. He was writing these sorts of papers. Now we're going to get him when he comes visits a village in Hunan. And so this link between repression and the topic of the research is a little bit weaker than we might think. And so perhaps that can inform your question a little bit. But I think that's a good argument for us to take into consideration. This other point, I think Margaret was raising it about ideology. And one thing I worry about is pressure in the opposite direction, right? So if we start kind of levying a lot of accusations of self-censorship, and all of a sudden people feel that their integrity requires them to do research that reaches a certain conclusion about the Chinese Communist Party, that is deeply problematic, right? And so as scholars, our job is to get the truth, right? It's not to advance an argument in one direction or another, it's to get the truth. And so if we have an environment where you feel pressure to only write things that are critical, and if that's how you establish your credibility for journalists and others, this is majorly problematic, and it's going to lead to major blind spots of our knowledge as a country about the Chinese political system. And so this is my worry. If we take these criticisms that are coming often from people, unfortunately, people who are outside the field who maybe aren't reading enough of our scholarship, I worry that it's going to bias things in the other direction, and we're going to have blind spots about the nature of the Chinese system.
Two quick points. One on this question of what the work would look like if people were not constrained. I would love to know the answer to what questions people think aren't being answered satisfactorily right now, because there actually is a pretty robust body of research on how Chinese citizens perceive the legitimacy of the Communist Party. There's a article that came out in the last couple months on how people respond to being exposed to propaganda, and basically finds that it really annoys them, but it also signals strength. The strength of the regime. So it has dual cross-cutting effects. There are people working on this stuff, and so I'm genuinely interested in this question of what academic scholarship do people think is not being done? Because I actually don't see a lot of holes right now. I see research on elite politics every day that I go into my office and read papers. I see research on security organizations, arrests, Rory's work on detentions. So I'm really genuinely curious, what's missing from the conversation? Is it that there's academic work that's not getting into the public discourse, or are there actual places where people think the academic work is not being done? Because I agree with Rory, I frankly just don't see what the holes are that aren't. And I work on sensitive issues and believe strongly in the need to tackle the things that are hard to do. And I just don't quite see what work isn't being done because it happens to be sensitive. Second point about inducements, it's a really important question. We didn't have a great way of getting at it. We asked people about funding, but I will say, at least in my field, access to senior officials is not enough to get you a doctoral degree or to get you a job. It just isn't. We are way past the point in political science where doing some interviews with some high-level people gets you a job. It just doesn't happen. I think maybe it's different for journalists in the think tank world, that access is more important, but I actually see much more concern about maintaining access in DC and in the think tank community than I do in the sort of university community. The work that King Pan and Roberts have done, the work that a lot of people have done on these sensitive topics, doesn't require access. I've done work on the domestic security apparatus and how it's funded that I did using yearbooks that are available in North America. I did go to China. I have some experience with that. I've done some field research there. But that wasn't enough to do any publications. The publications required data and expertise and sources that weren't a matter of sort of personal access. And I just think the idea that personal access is what makes a career is not the way, at least that my field has worked in the last sort of, the 10 years I've been in it.
Just a very quick point about carrots and inducements, and something that Rory said earlier about, about universities' ability, whether administrators are sufficiently knowledgeable in making certain kinds of decisions or establishing certain policies. We have recently had a conversation with one of the world's best-known universities about the fact that it is taking money for research from a very problematic Chinese company. And it became painfully obvious in the first 5 minutes of the conversation that said world-famous flagship research university had failed to do research about this company. Spectacularly, and the explanation was, well, they came to the same conferences we did, and they wrote papers on the same topics we did, so we figured they must be okay, to which we said, oh my God. And, I think the problem is, or let me put it this way, it's 2018. It is not 1978, right? Universities cannot fail anymore to understand at a very senior level the full scope of the interactions with Chinese SOEs, with the government, with different ministries at a very senior level, and to understand what the consequences are and to be informed and be able to make informed decisions as a result of that. Because I think it's not just that the administrators, I realize, Rory, you weren't offering this up as an excuse. The administrators didn't know. Excuse does not cut it anymore. You cannot not know at this point in time. And there's a lot of money at stake. And arguably what was most ironic about this conversation we had was that the researchers said in their defense, we were already working on these projects anyway, so we didn't really need the money, to which we, of course, said, well, then give it back, right? Your engagement with this company is problematic for your reputation. And they said, well, it's a lot of money. So I think we are well and truly into a time when universities really need to get a grip on what their relationships are broadly with China.
It's a related point, but it's not directly related. Well, we're talking about the self-censorship among academia, among academics. So the focus here, of course, is universities. But Scott and Isaac and I, we work in think tanks. And Sophie, you work a think tank / advocacy organization. So I've been in both fields, and I have this impression that if you think doing research is difficult in China, try to do some projects in China. Yeah, so doing research is about how to get good information, right? And there's censorship and self-censorship involved in that. But for think tanks, when we try to have dialogues with Chinese authorities, when we try to do, for example, advocacy organization, where I've also worked for advocacy organization, trying to provide, for example, assistance or training, or having dialogues with Chinese civil society about a certain, for example, open government information, which is, there are Chinese legislations about it. But when you try to engage the Chinese side on those topics, it becomes even more sensitive, because this is not just research, it's actually you're taking actions, trying to either to access information or try to actively change what is happening on the ground. So I feel that, yeah, there's a even bigger field over there that's not being discussed.
It's amazing how quickly time passes. And I just offer a couple comments at the end to a conversation that is not just gotten started, but I think we've reached a new part of the conversation, which is with your research and what we've talked about today. I think it's a critical question to ask, are we studying what we should be studying, the way we should be studying it as a profession, as a country? And oftentimes that's asking, what are we not studying? And so Don's question is well taken. I think you did have direct answers to that. That was, you asked people, And that's one way. And then the question is, do you accept people's answers? And we know how people respond in surveys in repressive environments. And you can adapt to that. We've got lots of experience with that type of research. And then you can also do content analysis of the work that is produced and decide, does that look like we have a fair representation of the topics that ought to be discussed? And I would go even further. I would say, look at the narratives that we are discussing. Could you do those in a Chinese context? And I think most of the questions that are important that we are discussing, you could not do in a Chinese context. They would not get published anywhere in China. I guess the last sign is how often we hear from Chinese who come to DC or when we go to China, how negative we all are now about China, right? How we've turned. And of course they mean about the Communist Party and its policies, right? But try to frame it as an anti-China thing, right? That word. And so I also question myself, well, am I being shaped by the political environment or by desire to have access in DC? I moved from Indiana to protected, tenured, to DC to a Cold War think tank. Have I turned unnecessarily to fit the DC environment or not? And I really think I think China's changing. China's really changing. Or the way the party is governing is changing. And I think that's leading to different types of research results and challenges. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we haven't talked about the norms of how scholars engage because of being American citizens. And there's, particularly in the think tank world, nonpartisanship is really like one of the key things that get drilled into our head every single day here at CSIS and many of the other think tanks is we can talk about positions, we can't talk about parties or individuals as much. To be very careful about that. And I think that affects how then we talk about other places. So some of the norms we have about here affects us when we go to other places and talk about their systems. Although I now know that as a think tanker, not as an academic, advocacy is a very important part of my job. It is central. It's central to the questions I choose and how I do the work, which I think is different from folks who are in academia. You don't necessarily have to be first driven by answering a policy-related question or speaking up, but though you're courageous for doing so, even though you don't get the brownie points and all those things that you should. I guess the last thing about universities, universities have offices of general counsels. Offices of those general counsels represent the university's institutional interests. They are there to protect the university as an institution, not the faculty and not the individual students. And I think that is a big question about what should the role of general counsels be vis-a-vis the faculty they hire, who they send out to the world to do work, to the students that they bring to their campus to study these complex and thorny questions. Do universities have a larger responsibility beyond keeping the university from getting sued? I think that's a big, big issue, which I hope universities themselves resolve, because I think that would be the best place to resolve it, rather than having some type of legislation or other types of regulations, although I think that's certainly possible. This last point is, we're having this conversation, and that is a very healthy sign for the field. We are dealing with those viruses and problems and disruptions to our intellectual freedom organism, and things aren't perfect. There are lots of challenges, but that we are having this conversation is for me, a good sign, a positive sign. And we are having this conversation because Rory and Sheena did this research. And so if you all would join me in thanking them and the rest of the panel.